Is it on? Yes, it's on. Okay. Before I start, I'm just gonna preface this talk, and thank you all for coming. So the format of this talk, as I've been told, is going to be 40-minute lecture, 20-minute Q&A. So if y'all come up with any questions, I welcome that. And there'll be kind of like 20 minutes at the end for that to happen. Okay, I'm going to start. Firstly, I would like to acknowledge our presence on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded people of the Monacan lands and waters, cared for by Monacan generations past, present, and emerging. Thank you to the University of Virginia Department of Art, the Dean of Art, the faculty, and the search committee that gave me the opportunity to talk to you today. Thank you to the administration, Lauren and Emily, for facilitating the talk, and to my travels here. In this lecture, I'm going to talk about what I do and not how I do it. My practice delves heavily into theory and lived experience as theory, but it's also a deep investigation of material histories. In the last 5 years, I've been exploring the material histories of porcelain, sugar, and soil. This lecture focuses on how these materials exist in relationship to us, each other, and through such reinforces or disrupts our notions of race and class throughout history. Monster, for monstrum, to show, warn, or remind by which gods give notice of calamity. Claire Chun, an Asian diasporic visual culture scholar, writes, "The etymology of the word monster reveals that the monster's presence, with its capacity to terrorize and terrify, is a warning call. We are in danger. What exactly we are in danger of depends on the kinds of monsters that appear in our field of vision, as well as those that may be lurking in the dark." Jack Halberstam writes that monsters are meaning machines. They combine the markings of a plurality of differences, a condensation of gender, race, nationality, class, and sexuality in one body. Monsters are historically produced hybrid subjects that embody the fears of the foreign and the perverse. Writing on Gothic horror, Halberstam attends to the textual production of the imagined national community in relation to the monster's narrative construction, as which terrifies and threatens the sanctity of the national body. In other words, the unassimilable foreign body is a monstrous one. The title of my talk is Monstrous Intimacies. The title draws from Christina Sharp's 2010 book, Monstrous Intimacies, Making Post-Slavery Subjects, in which she argues that the fundamental, familiar violence of slavery and racialized subjugation have continued to shape Black and white subjectivities into the present. In her book, she interprets African diasporic and Black Atlantic visual culture and literary texts that address monstrous intimacies, and the repetition as constitutive of post-slavery subjectivity. So in this context, I'm thinking through the many ways to view monstrosity as a compounding afterlife of violence, as a sort of grotesque aesthetic, one that can offer a different viewpoint that at its core decenters European Enlightenment ideals of beauty and being. I'm interested in the space of the grotesque implication because I don't think that a space of purity is possible or desirable. So intimacy becomes important in my practice. Lisa Lowe talks about intimacy as a guide to observe often obscured connections between Europe, emergence of liberalism, the Americas and settler colonialism, Africa and the transatlantic slave trade, and Asia and the global industry of trade. Lowe looks at distinct areas of the world and the people who live there, but instead of being desperate and disconnected, she tracks the ways that they are brought into intimate proximity with others. So in doing so, she is offering and disrupting the incompleteness of the past. So if we were to think of mixtural races, for example, we don't get bogged down by the literal mixed raceness, but through an intimacy of the past, we come to witness the ways racial difference animates a much larger story of power and resistance to power. Intimacy requires us to forefront connection and convergence when analyzing the colonial archive that emphasizes classification, collection, and documentation. My practice begins with the interrogation of my own body. as an Afro-Asian second-generation immigrant of Korean descent. Black and gendered as female, I turned to the living archives and combined aspects of my personal memory and history to forefront the liquidity and capaciousness of Blackness, shaped by the experience of diasporas. Research and material become the entry point of broader social political interrogations. I use sculpture, installation, performance, video, and social practice to explore legacies of imperial violence, and through such, care and survivance as frameworks for alternative possibilities of inhabitants and belonging. So this first work that I'm going to talk about is titled Moon Jar. Moon Jar, A number 312463230. So this is a life-size porcelain vessel. It's about 6 feet tall, 4 feet wide. It's referencing a moon jar, which is a really kind of traditional historical vessel that is usually made out of porcelain and made in 2 halves. So it's kind of cherished for its irregularity. It's meant to kind of reference purity through the whiteness of the porcelain, but also to the restraint of the artist's hand. So I wanted to reference this kind of 18th century Korean vessel and reimagine it. And so in this version, I created it life-size, covered it in porcelain slip, blackened it, and then adorned it. And the A number, for those who aren't familiar, it's a unique 8 to 7, sometimes 9-digit number that is assigned by a non-citizen of the Department of Homeland Security. And in this work, I'm also kind of thinking about chinoiserie. This is the first time in this lecture where you see it kind of shown. And chinoiserie is a pattern that was emerged in the 17th and 18th century in Europe. And it's usually kind of seen in these floral patterns. Sometimes we see it as a blue and white, kind of blue willow pattern, but it is kind of this idealized interpretation of Asian people and aesthetics that became really important during the influx of the silk trade and porcelain trade in the 17th and 18th century. And in this version, I wanted to recreate it. So instead of using a flower that we normally see, I used the orchid, which is my mother's favorite flower. I'm also referencing Afang Moy and Sarah Bartman and kind of like the shape of the vessel. So these are 2 examples of immigrant women. One Chinese immigrant woman that was in New York, and Sarah Bartman, who was kind of exhibited around Europe. One kind of, you can see she becomes ornament, and this idea of kind of Asiatic femininity and its relationship to ornamentation is important, and then kind of also thinking about the Black femme body and how it's mostly in relationship to flesh or fleshiness. So Christina Sharp, who is a Black feminist scholar, kind of asks us questions of how do we deal with the violence of slavery, and she offers that perhaps beauty could be an antidote, but what does the register of that beauty need to look like? And she offers that maybe monstrous beauty could be a way of reckoning with this kind of impossible violence of the afterlife of slavery. And so in this work, I'm repositioning and thinking about the moon jar through these kind of different lenses and reimagining chinoiserie, but also asking what happens when we consider ornamental forms and fungible surfaces rather than organic flesh as fundamental terms in the process of race making. So moon jar complicates the racialized figure where Black femininity is vestibular and Asiatic femininity is ornamental. And I'm just going to spend a few moments to talk about porcelain and chinoiserie as it comes up often in this lecture. So what we're looking at is 2 examples of it. The one on the right is a vessel that is kind of in this iconic blue and white pattern. This is actually from the Ming Dynasty, And on the left, we have a interpretation of kind of like this 19th century transferware of the blue willow pattern, where we see that there's these kind of like European kind of iconographies that are getting mixed into how they're imagining this pattern, and also kind of like fetishizing Asia. And so in this work, Textures of Enfleshment, A Silent Viewer, I'm reimagining my own blue and white pattern. This is an 18-foot wide, or 16-foot wide, 8-foot tall kind of interpretation of a wallpaper. It's in reference to some of these earlier wallpapers that we see up and down the East Coast, kind of in the 17th century. This particular one is this quote-unquote exotic scene in the home of Powell, who, after returning from like a trip in the 1760s, he became kind of enamored with like placing these exotic plants and all of these kind of like scenes of chinoiserie and Chinese silks in the home, and referencing and thinking about kind of like this trade. And so we now see this wallpaper kind of everywhere in our everyday life, and I wanted to think about what it means to trace the lineage of this and to use my own iconography to make up these quintessential kind of images that we see within the wallpaper. One of them being kind of like the architecture, another one being the flower. In this particular one, I'm using the national Korean flower, and then kind of like the scene of the person working. On top, there's a kind of cast, a porcelain mask that is coated in candied brown sugar. These are the reference photos that you actually see in the work itself. And so I'm really kind of thinking again about the relationship of migration and movement and travel, and through kind of reimagining this pattern, I'm thinking about my own family lineage and this kind of forced migration out of Korea to the US by US military occupation. And then I also just want to note and point out that the bottom right photo, left I guess for y'all, is actually a photograph of the home that I grew up in, and I will talk about that a little bit more, about the significance of that architecture. So where kind of like the white would be, brown is transferred, it's encrusted in brown sugar. And so when you kind of come up to the work, you're kind of you're consumed by it. And then there's also this really kind of potent, lingering smell or of sweetness of the sugar that's kind of leaves with you and is meant to kind of refer to this afterlife of slavery that is always with us. This architecture becomes significant because as we are in Charlottesville, Virginia, and on University of Virginia's campus, there's a lot of overlap with my research and thinking about the ways that the chinoiserie pattern, especially in the 17th and 18th century, really influenced the founding fathers in the architecture of the South. And a lot of the architecture was borrowing from the chinoiserie, as you can see, like this Chippendale pattern that then makes its way to the pavilion, that really kind of became the language for the way that we're viewing Enlightenment. And so it's also kind of reinforcing this idea of race and racism through this language. And it really kind of like permeates the landscape and also is another moment in which these two convergences are happening. This is a different version of the work that I showed in 2024 at the Massachusetts College of Liberal Arts. And in this version, there are 4 masks. Each of them are different, and they're made to kind of are presented in this way. One, a celadon mask, the other porcelain. You have the blue and white, and you again see this iconography of the rose, which becomes important in my practice to think about this monstrous beauty. And then you also have a porcelain covered in sugar. And so by kind of showing you this variations of these self-portraits, I'm really asking the viewer to consider to their assumptions of which one is more real and which one is more monstrous. I'm going to briefly talk about this work as a way to bring in this concept of liquidity that comes up in my practice, or the aesthetics of the drip. So this particular work is titled Looked Until Your Tongue Rubbed Raw. It's conceived in 2020, and in an earlier slide in the intro, there was a version that I displayed at the Wattis Institute in 2023. But what we're looking at are 14 kind of like handmade porcelain plates that are adorned in this kind of hand-painted blue and white patterns. Then there's sugar skins, so they're very thin replicas of body parts of myself that are placed onto the plates, and then the idea is that they kind of disintegrate during the course of the show. And there's also these unplugged microphones at the bottom. But the unplugged microphones are kind of playing into this idea of colored people time, which is essentially this framework in which Black folks and people of color have been conditioned to labor on a specific time scale. And so this refusal of actually performing on that time scale through lateness is actually kind of a liberatory act. And so I'm kind of refusing this performance or amplifying this performance of the drip of the sugar with the unplugged microphones, and then kind of like this aesthetic of the drip becomes something that I then explore in this next work, titled "Of Eaters and the Eaten," and this is a 16-foot by 10-foot large table. I'm thinking about this as a tablescape, but also as an ontology, as a body itself. So what we're looking at is a sea of kind of sugar and porcelain. So it's a display of an ontology. It's in a perpetual state of transient escape, morphing and melting and mutating. The broken porcelain tiles, oozing blue and white plates adorn the table. Kintsugi parodokeloids, acknowledging the violence and brokenness while offering coagulation as a product of healing. Candied brown sugar is then poured onto the table, leaking and pooling, disrupting the porcelain tableware and acting as gestural Black beings, reclaiming and occupying a space that has historically consumed them. The drip and the ooze become an aesthetic of collapse and leakage. Melting is not only an act of decay, but a mode of what Fred Moten terms Black fugitivity, or a spirit of escape, a freedom drive, and a death drive. So Of Eaters and a Eaten is kind of really using sugar, which is now this kind of banal mass-produced household item, and it becomes highlighted as this reminder of its colonial exploitation legacy, making its consumption possible. So the actual table itself is broken porcelain tiles, and there's raw sugar, white sugar, that's acting kind of as the grout, but it's also kind of in its conception failing to do that. This is a series of works called keloid sculptures. Some of them adorn this tablescape. And a keloid, for those who don't know what it is, it's essentially a raised scar of the body after it's been injured. So it's when the body produces too much protein. So let's say you like fall down and scrape your knee, and then when it heals, you're still kind of like reminded of that scar through the raisedness of it. And this has also been used in kind of ancient African traditions of scarification, so a beautification like through this painful like cutting of the skin. So these keloid sculptures, I'm calling them also cannibalized tchotchkes. So in this process, really thinking about kind of like the consequences of globalization and also this relationship of sugar and porcelain to the tablescapes in the 17th and 18th centuries. So with kind of bourgeoisie class, there would be these sugar pastelage sculptures that were white sugar paste, and they would be at these banquets that would be fed and broken off kind of at the end of the night as these sweet treats or fed to the lower class. But during the process of the transatlantic slave trade, as more sugar was coming into production and it spread to the lower classes, sugar lost its value, and they kind of transferred these little figurines that were made out of sugar to porcelain. So that's how we're getting these kind of tchotchkes that we see everywhere. And so there's this relationship to power, class, race that is embedded in these figurines. And so what I'm doing is I'm sourcing them, and then I'm making these flower appliques that are made out of porcelain, and I attach them onto these figurines. I cover it in porcelain slip, and then I glaze them. And through that, they start cracking, kind of like skin, and then the glaze from the underneath comes through. But I'm also, in this moment, thinking, in the way that I'm using the flower, I'm thinking of it as, again, like this coagulation. So in Toni Morrison's Beloved, there's this moment where she's talking about the markings or the whipping markings on Seth's back. And that being this really pivotal moment where Seth, by relating it to a Virginia chokecherry tree, is able to come out of the violence and come back to herself through relating it to some sort of ornamentation. And so I'm proposing that, you know, this rose or this adornment, through obscuring kind of like these racialized figurines and then coating them in these glazes, which a lot of them have histories as it relates to either Korea or China, the Celadon glaze, and mixing them, kind of asking these questions about mixtural races, but also about purity. These particular tchotchkes are also thinking about the actual literal mixed raceness of porcelain. It's made of putence and also putence, which is called the flesh of porcelain, and then also the body of porcelain is made out of koilin, which is the bone. So it's literally made out of bones and flesh. And so I wanted to, in this series, kind of think of the ways that these materials have literally been racialized and the conception of them in the 17th and 18th century. And when you go back through the archives, the way that they're talking about this white gold as it pertains to sugar and porcelain, and then also kind of like the purity and relating it to like skin and the ways in which kind of we do that with these inanimate objects. This just seems like a little bit of a shift in my practice, but it's gonna all come back together at the end. This work is probably the earliest work that I show in this presentation, and it's titled "We've Always Been Here Like Hydrogen, Like Oxygen." It's a double channel video that was displayed on the side of a church in 2020. And it was the first time that I'm kind of thinking about land and the implications of land on the body. It was performed at the Richmond Slave Trail and the African Burial Ground in Richmond, Virginia. And this use of the orange is in reference to the LaTosha Harlins uprisings, the LA uprisings, and really thinking about like what does it mean to create a safe space for women and girls in their bodies. I was filming this during the thick of lockdown, Black Lives Matter movement, and it was right after Breonna Taylor had died. And I was seeing these correlations between the way that kind of LaTosha Harlan's story had been erased and overshadowed by Rodney King's. LaTosha Harlan was shot in the back of the head trying to buy orange juice by a Korean store clerk. She was 15 years old and was actually trying to pay for the orange juice. And then kind of thinking about this history of the silencing of their stories, and the same thing happened with Breonna Taylor and George Floyd. And so I'm kind of linking these temporalities of the LA riots, of this history and legacy of slavery, the current moment of 2020, and I'll show a little bit of the clip. stop it there. It's about a 7.5-minute video that is shown in a few different ways. One is that double channel, and others are in a single channel version. But that work kind of led me to this body of work titled Somewhere on the Edge, Temporal Entanglements. And a lot of it is thinking about this, this idea of care, care as it relates to kind of like these histories of violence, but also kind of how do we even contend with the current moment that we're in. So Christina Sharp writes, "Wake work refuses to silence the ongoing past. It brings a radically different kind of care to bear the present." This Ode to Soil performance is a moment in 2020 where I was back home in Charlottesville, Virginia, and I was kind of reinvestigating the landscapes around me, and one of them was Penn Park in Charlottesville, which is a golf course and also kind of like this recreation park, but it also was an antebellum plantation, and it was named after John Warner, who was one of the first slave traders in the Americas. And for this performance, I uprooted these yucca from my great-grandmother's yard that was granted to the family post emancipation, and I transplanted them to this site, kind of guerrilla style, as the sun was rising. And I planted them to mark the unmarked slave graves that were at this site on the golf course. So there was kind of like no acknowledgement, no memorial to these people. Even the RAS report that I had found that kind of did the geological excavation of the space, the city had been sitting on for a few years and didn't release the information to the public. And so in this moment, I started to think about soil as Christina Sharp is talking about soil in relationship to residence time. Residence time is the amount of time that it takes for sodium to break down in the body. And she's talking about that in relationship to those in the Middle Passage who were tossed overboard for insurance money, or even those who jumped ship. And it takes 250 million years for the sodium in our bodies to kind of break down in the water. And so she's kind of using this as an example to talk about how they are still physically with us in water. And I'm interested in thinking about that in land. It's significant in the less amount of time. It's about 300 years, but that still means that they're physically with us in the land. And what does it mean for that to actually be kind of like the nutrients that are supplying the growth of these transplanted yucca? Yucca are also used within kind of older African American and enslaved communities as headstone markers because of their resiliency, but also because headstones were too expensive. So this is another moment where I start to think about this relationship of monumentality and monuments, and kind of, do they serve the people in which they're intended to serve? How can we think of this language and gesture that isn't linked to kind of like these European ideals of monumentality, or even the material in which we're referencing it to? So this kind of ephemeral marking or memorial was a way to kind of like gesture to this, the ephemeral way in which I have witnessed in a lot of Black and brown communities are made to kind of pass down languages or hold these histories within family, which can be through cooking, through dancing, through gardening, through these different practices. This work kind of led me to this next work that is essentially was reckoning with what does it mean, how do we think about Black aliveness when it's so kind of indexed to death, especially within today's American context and historical context. And so this installation was done in 2021, and it actually used the soil from that specific location. And it was installed at the front of the gallery so that the viewer was confronted with the soil and was made to actually dirty themselves, walk over these cast kind of bodies that were growing plants and celosia off of them to enter into the rest of the gallery. So I was also interested in how do I implicate the viewer in this history, but also kind of in this protagonist way to have these conversations around the way that soil is politicized, its kind of connotations to dirtiness. It also kind of especially within gallery settings, having this language around how do we neutralize it, how do we make it available so that it doesn't kind of infiltrate any of the other works in the gallery. So this particular work, like I said, is growing celosia, which is a plant native to East Africa, smuggled in women's hair during the transatlantic slave trade. It's also used for a lot of different medicinal reasons. It's used for sustenance. And I really wanted to think about these technologies and these ways of like knowing and being that have really been preserved in our foundational in our society. And there was also, I do want to mention, a very extreme, intense smell in the gallery with this work. Again, thinking about this infiltration of the body with the smell without having permission from the viewer to kind of like infiltrate their body with this scent. It was kind of made because I had to tend to these bodies over the course of the exhibition to kind of watering them so that they were growing. That work led to this work titled On Belonging, The Space in Between, which started off with a road trip from LA to Virginia, kind of going through black migratory paths and stopping at the borderlines of each state and collecting the soil where the soil couldn't be claimed by either or state. So it was kind of like this liminal space. And the collection of all of that kind of created these soil samples that I'm calling it. And it's installed in this way to resemble a wake. So the way that the viewer and their body is navigating the space is kind of like in this really kind of pensive, thoughtful like performance of the body and viewing it. The work on the sculpture on the farthest left had a 500-pound candied sugar base that collapsed on itself during the course of the show. The celosia in this work was grown from seedling, and I started growing it in California, and then I was really interested in kind of placing it into the soil sample where the gallery that I was installing in didn't have any natural light. So what does it mean to kind of tend to this plant and then place it in an environment where it's subject to kind of die? So it died over the course of the 2-month exhibition. And each of these soil samples are also archive photos. Some of them kind of reappear in my practice, some coming from my family archive. There's also some coming from specific sites and locations. And this image kind of excavated in the soil is a photo of Penn Park, but also pop cultural moments to kind of create this constellation of how we are conceiving and thinking of home and these histories that are implicating us and our bodies that are actually kind of like upholding these structures in place. This particular one was made out of porcelain, and this is actually the first time that I showed porcelain and sugar in relationship to one another in a work. So this last little bit is titled Counter Monuments, and it's really thinking about these two particular projects and also this idea again that memorials and monuments kind of as they stand are failures. And this is a quote by Christina Sharp that says, every memorial and museum to atrocity already contains its failure. This work is titled Operations of Care. It's a co-founded project between Luis Vasquez LaRoche and I. It's installed in Charlottesville, Virginia at Visible Records. And we were approached by Reclaiming the Monument in Richmond, and they kind of asked us, okay, if you could reimagine a monument, what would it be? What would it look like? So we took the traditional plinth of the monument. We made it the dimensions of kind of like seating and lounging so people could gather and rest. But instead of having the singular kind of Confederate statue or person or member in the center, it's a community garden bed. So we're kind of decentralizing the singular and kind of recentering community. And the soil from the beds are actually from locations where former Confederate monuments have been pulled down in the area. And then the plants grown within the beds are really focused on plants and herbs, flora, fauna, and medicinal plants that were aiding in the self-liberation of enslaved people and of the Black community post-emancipation. So this work is also kind of in collaboration with two organizations, Common Field Crew and Solitary Gardens, that also have gardens at this space. And in this last work, this is a rendering of a project that is actually going to unveil in August in Boston at the Rose Kennedy Greenway. This is titled Going to Ground. In the initial photo, this is a rendering of Zipporah Powder Atkins' home. So this whole work is using Vanessa Agard Jones' thinking around what it means to go to ground. And she talks about it as this way to redefine our relationship to land for those who, to kind of reposition the way that we're thinking about our relationship to land that's not based on a plantation forum. And she's talking about ground thoughts or plant thoughts as kind of the limbs or like the appendages of the ground. They're the way that we can kind of see how the ground is thinking. It's a way to kind of think through the way that soil has the capacity to both hold these histories of trauma, but also produce something new and beautiful and liberatory. And so this project, Going to Ground, is rethinking Zipporah Potter Atkins' home, who was the first Black woman to own a home and land in 1670 in colonial Boston. And this is the actual reconstruction of her home. And this project is essentially going to use this home as this kind of liminal structure. So the top of the awning of the home has the scarification pattern, and it acts as a sundial. So as the sun is coming through, it's casting the scarification onto the landscape. The foundation of the home will also be made of soil, but there will be an international open call to soil. And I'm just going to read that call to soil to end the lecture. Dear community, can we go to ground together? Soil is a site of possibility, a living archive, a material that speaks in its own time. Heeding scholar Vanessa Agard Jones' insistence on going to ground, this open call invites you to enter your earth as a communal gesture in open-hearted labor in Black and brown placemaking, even only for a time. Join us as we conspire etymologically to breathe together toward reconstructing Zipporah Potter Atkins' 16 by 14 two-story home, brought by Atkins in 1670 while living in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Atkins sold her house in 1690 and was its sole deed holder for the 2 decades she lived there. Today, Atkins' deed is the remaining primary record evidencing her life. In her first short story, Zora Neale Hurston's central character, John Redding, muses, "Then a soft wind, like love, passes over and warms me, and a summer rain comes down like understanding and softens me, and I push a blade of grass or a flower or maybe a pine tree. That's the ground thinking." As we come together to celebrate and speculatively engage with Atkins' life, we invite you to source soil from your own site of thinking, a place where soil has personal or shared meaning. What does your ground mean to you? We invite your intention and intimacy as we hone our ecological attention. Your soil collections will live on in the bricks that comprise the foundation of Atkins' home on what is now part of the Rose Kennedy Greenway that runs along the Boston Harbor. The Boston Harbor was critical to the ecology and infrastructure of the transatlantic slave trade. In the 1980s, the city of Boston displaced 10,000 primary Black, brown, and immigrant residents to build the John F. Fitzgerald Expressway, which caved amid financial and construction constraints. The second conversion project, known as the Big Dig, was a failed mega project and the nation's most expensive highway project. In 2008, the city converted the expressway into a 1.5 mile long public park. Our collaboration sits on the site of both Atkins' home and among the lived experiences of thousands of residents who built lives there. Like repair, soil moves slowly. In the wake of archival and state's failures to attend to Black life, we look to Black scholarship and practices to account for our livelihoods. We invite you to dig with us, toward community-engaged performances flush with Black aliveness, as we deepen our understanding of Zipporah Potter Atkins' life and spaces of impossibility, and imagine what's possible through our shared attention. To participate, we offer the following processes. Find a site that is significant to you, your home, a relative's home, a historical site, garden, or otherwise. Dig and gather as much or as little soil as you desire in a vessel fitting for you. Place the soil in the mailing package provided and address the package to Zipporah Potter Atkins. Add a note about the soil or any thoughts you want to share with us. Mail your soil, and there's moments for questions. If you have questions or comments or feedback on how I can make the talk better. I welcome all criticism or praise.
I'm so affected by your work. I remember seeing your 5 minutes at the beginning of the residency, and it's just really incredible. The feelings that come up, hearing about your work, and the sort of call to action that I feel that is just merely from absorbing the marks of your work, and the marks that are just almost like a rhythm that you picked up through history that never stopped, and it's just such incredible work.
Thank you.
So moved by your work, and I feel a major call to action every time I think about it.
Thank you. Yeah, I think repetition, like that through line that you were talking about, is important for me. And Saidiya Hartman, in her book, Transgressing the Pain Body, she talks about repetition as this practice, and thinking about address and asking the question of, like, is address even possible? And she proposes no, it's not, when we're dealing with these really kind of like extreme violent histories. But this act of repeating is actually important, because in every moment in which we strive, we learn something, even if we don't attain the goal. But that allows us to, again, have kind of like the endurance or the hope to try again, even though we can't ever maybe redress it. And so I do think about my practice in that way of kind of like this repetition, even kind of like more literally, and work like, gosh, there's so many slides. And work like this, where like I'm literally repeating this imagery, and in that act, it becomes less about my singular personal history and kind of becomes the collective through the plurality, or just through these through lines and convergences of even kind of how I'm talking and thinking about history in the ways that it's really kind of so intertwined. Like, not so much interested in talking about porcelain if it's not in relationship to sugar, because there's so many kind of like overlaps in how, or kind of like relationships with how kind of like with the emancipation of, or the freeing of enslavement, comes the rise of indentured servitude of Asian workers, especially like on these sugar plantations. So that's all like in relationship to one another. And so going back to kind of like thinking about these repetitions and these through lines, that is something that I am trying to kind of reckon with, and maybe through its violence, propose something like a futurity that we can not sit within the violence, but also acknowledge it, because otherwise we have amnesia and we just repeat it. But have it in proximity so we don't kind of like replicate it.
Just to finish that in response, I also see your work as a sort of open channel, like you're saying, I feel like I want to say it's non-linear because it seems huge, but it's actually really like laser focused at the same time, but it's open. It's open and continuous, and it shows everywhere with the timelessness, but also the way the sugar falls apart, but then you solidify it again with the glazing and the sculpting, and then the same thing with the microphones. They're there, but they're not plugged in. It's all so executed so well that that this kind of work and intention has created an open channel for a viewer to have an experience that is almost like shared.
Yeah, that's like, thank you for saying that. I do, and I think that is something that I think a lot about in the work is, though I'm doing a lot of this research and pulling from these histories, it's very much in the present. A lot of these patterns that I'm referencing and using are ones that I grew up in the home with. So thinking about domesticity, thinking about interiority, not only of the home, but also of kind of the metaphysical state or the psychological state, and how they kind of like transcend time. So thinking about how the past is simultaneously the present and influencing us in the future. And so this kind of like these blue and white pattern, the blue willow, the chinoiserie, the porcelain, though at one point in time it kind of represented this power and wealth and class. And, now you can find a tchotchke at like 7-Eleven, which is like hilarious. But I'm interested in the ways that kind of like these consequences of globalization and the way that they're impacting and how we're relating to objects, and also how we perform those objects within the home as this kind of identifier or reflection of our own kind of accumulation, or way that we're thinking about ourselves and our positionality within the world. So like, it was really a breakthrough moment growing up in the home and seeing kind of this Asian aesthetic and this Black interior aesthetic merging and creating this really new language, especially situated within the global South, or within Virginia in particular. And through research, realizing kind of, the implications, the racialization of these materials, but also how in the home, especially this blue and white pattern, wasn't really about that. It in a lot of homes, it's actually kind of taken out of that realm, and it is used more as like, I wouldn't say a relic, but it's a cherished object. And for me, realizing that through my mother, that it was less about the object itself, but kind of represented this home place, which she had no access to. And so those moments to me are really beautiful, and are also a way of like how we repurpose and recontextualize these histories of violence. And we see that within like Black material culture, through fashion, through all of these aesthetics of how we're repurposing kind of even kind of like the use of gold in my practice. I'm thinking about kintsugi, which is a Japanese method of, I don't know if there's a good photo of it, of kind of mending brokenness. And like through the mending, it kind of creates a stronger object through that brokenness, through the mending with that adhesive. And then I'm also just thinking about the way that gold is used within like Black material aesthetic, thinking about grills, thinking about chains, thinking about the way that ornamentation has been used again, like this keloiding of a way to bring out of the history of the way that it has been used to dehumanize and kind of give us some sort of humanity or something. So these ways of subverting, either like through or like the ornamentation, or subverting in the moon jar with the literal like blackening of this like Confucianary object that is meant to be pure and white, or even when I'm interacting in these performances and I'm like guerrilla styling them and like literally in this public space where, you know, I'm could easily get arrested, which is another reason why I wore overalls, so I could kind of blend in and look like I'm a worker. And so like, what are these, like this like this place of liminality is one that's really fruitful for me. That's why I kind of talk about Fred Moten and fugitivity, of kind of like being able to occupy multiple spaces at the same time. And through that to kind of have this expanded notion of what like Blackness can be or looks like, and not just this, especially within kind of an art or academic context of like what it is, it's sugar, or like in the art world it's Black portraiture or whatever. It's actually very nuanced and different and plural. And I don't even remember the initial question, but does anyone else have a question? Does anyone else have any like comments how I can make it better?
Well, I really liked learning about the use of the medium in your work. This is really my first real introduction to, more of what you do, and I like that idea of like the medium being the message, and the use of sugar and all those I found really fascinating. I also like the correlation of like the use of the body throughout the work, and even in the video using your own body and the face and the bodies in the dirt, and then even like the bodies being made of the earth, which has like a female connection to it. I just really enjoyed how that plays on art history and like Venus and the idea of the body as a vessel. I feel like there's a lot of layers to that, so just me personally, I like you exploring like the body and the figurative work. I am very interested to ask more about the how. I know you said.
Oh yes, ask. This is the time. Yes, ask me about the how.
What you do, not how you do, but yeah, like with the bodies in the earth, like
Yeah.
were you creating a mold? Like how did you get them to remain so detailed? Like using just is the earth, is the soil more like a clay?
Yeah, so what I'm doing is I'm creating full body casts. And so I'm using the cast as the mold. And so it's the same double body silk that kind of set users use. And so I'm then using the soil, I'm mixing it with a little bit of water and a little bit of clay. And then I press it in and then kind of just flip the mold. And so that's how I'm using it. In my practice, I try to not use like, I don't really clean the soil. I don't really use preservatives. I really want the soil to do what soil does. And so I'm not trying to kind of, and in all of my work, like I'm not trying to manipulate the material. And I think that's part of the process of letting the material kind of speak for itself and how it wants to act. So that even happens kind of with the sugar cast, which I'm using exactly the same way as like a body mold that I'm then making like candied sugar, which is essentially the same recipe as a lollipop. And then adhering them to the plates, but literally just through melting. There's no kind of like glue or anything. Yeah. I did not get to see that piece, but I heard that it also had this very intense sweetness. This particular work does have a smell. When I first installed it, you walked into the gallery and you're like, "Whoa!" It kind of gets trapped in there because everything on this table is either made out of porcelain or sugar, except for the glass, which I kind of melted down and I sloped. But so the porcelain tiles, like I was saying, the white sugar grout, and then it's again this candied brown sugar that is spilled on top. And yeah, in this particular kind of body of work, I was really thinking too about like this compounding, like this overwhelmingness, like even with the size of this or even the size of the wallpaper, it kind of engulfing your body, or the size of the moon jar kind of like gazing over you, of like how could I, like through sculpture, through the way that our body is interacting with it, just feel overwhelmed and kind of like lose agency or something, or like not that kind of line between consent gets confused. And so with the smell with this, I was thinking about it, but also with the size. And then when I install it, it's kind of insane. It's so large. I have to put 2 ladders on each side and then put like a board in between. And it's like kind of like walking a tightrope. It's like it's very large. It's probably, it's like much larger than the stage. And so even like in all my work, there's this is relationship to labor, with kind of the making of each of these, handcrafting them, painting every single one, using these different techniques through the scale, or even kind of through the way that I almost like insist upon this sort of handmadeness as a way to really connect with my material and let it speak to me. Yeah.
I love this.
Thank you.
Everything was incredible. I have a question.
Yes.
And I'm trying to figure out how to word it in a way that makes any sense at all. Something I'm really impressed with and I'm sort of curious about in your work is sort of the viewer's place in it. The viewer's kind of called to participate in a lot of different ways throughout all these different, I was about to say eras, but I'm realizing these are very simultaneous, like these pieces. So like in this one, the smell, right? You're kind of participating by way of the smell, and you have a choice but to kind of like be present with the smell. You have to like step over the body casts. The one where I believe it was called On Belonging is sort of set up like a wig. So you're performing, you're participating in that space, in that mode. And then we have like Operation of Care, where there's like the actual community garden element, and that is participatory. And I'm just thinking of all these different like modes of participation, and I'm just kind of curious like how that has expanded in your work, like how you see the viewer, or if you even use the word viewer, like how you see participation working in your work. Is that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think it's definitely changed throughout time. Implication becomes a mode that I use very often. And I think implication becomes important because it almost talks to this history of the body and the way that the Black femme body, the Asian body has been kind of displayed, interacted with, put in relationship to these materials, these histories, and kind of without consent. But in that implication, there's also, like you said, there's this call to action, or this idea that I'm like this thing around care that keeps coming up. Though there's violence, I'm also thinking about its relationship to care and those negotiations. And so that's where community becomes important. I think about care often as you would eating. Like you have to eat every day, multiple times a day. Care is this endurance that you have to build. And also it's in relationship to others. And so in earlier works, I am really thinking about the singular, my body, the implications of my body and what it means, how it's been racialized, like positioning it within this historical canon, but also kind of like within these landscapes to think through that. But then as my work is progressing, I'm also thinking about how do I protect myself? It becomes really vulnerable to constantly kind of like be putting you and your body out there, and especially in these performance ways or performative ways, and contending to with this legacy of display of the Black female body. And so it became crucial in my practice to kind of expand and think about the antidote to that. And so that's kind of where the way, at least in this work, I refuse to have any representations of the body. So I'm thinking about what can, like, thinking about like what can liminality offer us? How can I use opacity in these different ways as a way to kind of protect, but note at these histories, like these pores and pools are inherently kind of gestural. They can be lakes, they can be rivers, they can be bodies, they start to take on many different things. But it was really important to like refuse that. In earlier works, like the work Licked Until Your Tongue Rubbed Raw, like that was the importance of the microphones, because I understood that the way that that work is showed, it's as display, right? And I was thinking a lot about these like portraits, like your great-grandmother's like portraiture wall or something. So I was interested in kind of like reimagining that. But then also, again, going back to this idea of what does it mean to kind of like place these materials that inherently perform, and then have and include some active like, and sometimes like really small like acts of refusal. And so those small acts started to become kind of influence my social practice work. And to think about more of like how are we thinking about the similarities within these histories, and how can we think about deep solidarity, not just like a performativity of that. I don't know if that answered it.
No, that was awesome.
Okay. Yeah.
Oh gosh, yeah. Everything's people have been saying, but there's so much to think about. Like it feels very rich, your talk, and
Yeah.
like the conversation. Like there's so many possible threads. I think like if you in terms of critical, it would be like what I would give anyone doing a speech, like just practice and
Yeah.
take your time. And you don't have to say all the things about you can also like hone in on exactly what you want to communicate, and like you did with the how. Like I like how you were like, I'm not going to get into this, but if people want to ask about it or whatever, because obviously just like I bet you could spend days and days talking about your work. I feel like there's just so much there. It's so rich. I was going to ask about the risk piece. So it's interesting that you got to that about like, because that was something that was coming up for me, is like, how do you relate to like risk to your body in art, and like, and that was interesting, but also like, I find it really interesting that when your body isn't there, like when a body isn't there, then suddenly for me the work feels like haunted, or like there's all this like other things creep in, and I feel like this to me like is so I could just stare at this all day, like this of eaters and the eaten. I feel like I'm like with so many, I'm with a bunch of people that aren't here.
Yeah.
I'm with like future people. Like I just feel like it's like crowded, but like in this really interesting way that I think is facilitated by like your use of materials that aren't the human body, but that are like coming in and
Yeah.
pointing at flesh and pointing at like these things that you're talking about. It's really interesting.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's just bringing up a lot. So that's not a question so much as just like feedback that like very impactful.
Thank you. Anything else? Thank you all for sharing this hour with me.
Thank you for sharing this with us.